I'm still thinking about analogies, partly drawn on this Doug Hofstadter video that I mentioned a couple of days ago, which is really great. But also the analogy that I've been kicking around between vegetarianism and atheism. Because there's some interesting stuff there, you know. I mean, some of the comments in the videos, you know, are saying things like, oh, this analogy fails and so on. Which of course it will do, you know, all analogies fail if you test them in the right way. And that's not really the point, you know, is it? Because analogies don't really reflect circumstances in the world. They reflect parallels in systems of thought. And, and of course they'll break down. And people have got motivations quite often for developing analogies and for breaking them down, you know. I mean, I've got, you know, cards on the table, I've got an agenda. I don't think I'm trying to flog it, but to the extent that it's inbred in me, I can't help it. You know, I've got an agenda for developing an analogy between atheism and vegetarianism, because I am both atheist and vegetarian, and they are, for me, moral positions. So, of course, I've got a vested interest in saying that analogy holds water. If you're not of that persuasion, you know, if you're a carnivore or a theist or a carnivore theist, then you might have a vested interest in destabilising that analogy or finding points of weakness in it and bringing out other aspects of the relationships, which is, you know, it's equally fine. But as I say, they're not really to do with situations out there in the world, are the analogies? This is something that Doug Hofstadter says. They're not. You know, there isn't a real relationship between anything that's connected through analogy. It's about how the brain works and how the mind works, how thought works and how thought proceeds, and creates new thoughts, you know, and that kind of stuff. That's what analogy is about. You know, and sometimes I think if you are going to need new thoughts, you need to make new analogies, and if you're going to clear the way for new thoughts, you might need to break old ones. So these are useful processes, I think. Anyhow, just a small update, I guess, for self, note to self, because I made this video yesterday called Bint Farming is for Me, which I haven't really thought about at the time. I know I was just wandering through a field, making a video about something completely different. This camera ran out of battery, so I went to my phone cam, and I don't know, it just occurred to me to talk about that. But in that video, I hadn't realised it, but I was drawing the analogy between dietary preference and sexual preference. You know, basically the video is a kind of stalking horse for questions about the ethics of eating animals again, as opposed to the ethics of having sex with animals. You know, if we think it's okay to eat animals, why do we think it's not okay to have sex with them? It is slightly odd when you think about it. I'm not saying there's an answer to that, only that it prompts strange questions, interesting questions. Anyhow, just as I say, I hadn't really thought about the motivations for making that, I just made it. But now I realise what's happening in my head is that there's like a three-way analogy going on. I've got this analogy that I started off with between atheism and vegetarianism. You know, basically saying that theism is to... hang on a second. Yeah, atheism is to God as vegetarianism is to meat. That's the kind of set of dimensions that analogy works across. Atheism is to God. We don't think there is one. It's possibly a toxic idea. As vegetarian is to meat. We don't accept the validity of that named substance. And we think it's possibly a toxic idea. That's an analogy I was just kicking around for a while, which has its weaknesses. But now there's this third one, which is to do with dietary preference as opposed to sexual preference. I'm not quite sure how to phrase that in terms of a set of analogical dimensions. Let me just have a think about that for a sec. Because I need one of those A is to B, C is to D things. Dietary preference, sexual preference. I don't know, I can't think of it. Anyway, all I'm saying there is that for me right now, there's a three-way relationship, and I can kind of feel it, even though I can't articulate it. I can kind of feel my thoughts circulating in that, across those three areas. You know, so when I'm thinking about atheism and theism, I can kind of feel arguments creeping in to do with dietary preference, and I can also feel arguments creeping in to do with sexual preference. So the various moral and ethical statements that associate with those things are all kind of informing one another in my head, kind of, which is interesting, I think. Anyway, that's all. Yeah, but just this analogy thing, it's quite fascinating actually, because in this Hofstadter video he gave a couple of examples of how he caught himself in the act of analogical thinking. Just really simple examples, but very clear. And he was saying that these things happen all the time, probably, but normally, unless you're primed to recognise them, or you have a particular interest, as he clearly does, these things would just pass you by, and they just be part of your normal train of thought, the normal processes by which one thought leads to the next. But because he is sensitised to them, because it's an interest, he kind of catches himself in the act of analogical thinking. And I've been trying to do that, and I've caught myself one yesterday. It was really interesting actually. I was just sitting at the table and I had this like a big Safeways bag full of bits and pieces. The stuff that I brought up from Cornwall just as I was leaving the house. It was just random stuff really. And Guy, one of my dogs, he came over really excited because he thought there might be something for him in there, and he's all bounding over like this. And I put my hand in the bag and pulled out the first thing, and it was Guy's muzzle, which he's wearing right now because he has to wear a muzzle because he's got an asthma out against him. And it was Guy's muzzle, and he saw this muzzle, and I don't want to put thoughts into a dog, but he saw this muzzle and he just like backed off and kind of fell, and his ears went down, and he moved off back to his bed. And if you were going to characterise that psychologically, you would say he was disappointed or dejected or horrified, maybe scared. Certainly what seemed to be excitement had completely reversed. And at that moment, just as he did that, I got this really quick flashback to 20 years ago, when it must be more than that, 25 years ago, when my nephew, who's now in his early 30s, he was about 7 or 8 then, and it was Christmas, and his grandma, my mum, was giving him a present. She gave him a bunch of little presents, but and one of these presents was like a bucket of little toys, and he opened the toys up, and at the top of the toys was this massive plastic spider, and my nephew was at the time quite frightened of spiders, and he opened this up, and this look on his face was complete, because he'd been excited at Christmas, opened the present, and he got that sensation. And I got the flashback of that. I saw Marv doing this, going through this process, and I can only think that was a piece of analogical thinking going on in my head. The shape of the experience that my dog had, or the shape of that whole little scenario of this, a container containing something unknown, a moment of excitement leading up to that, a revealing of that thing, and then an overturning of the emotion so it becomes negative. That shape of those experiences were the same. There's analogues between them. Guy is to Marv. No, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Guy is to the muzzle as Marv was to the spider. My Safeways bag. I was to my Safeways bag as my mum was to this pot of toys. The muzzle was to Guy as the spider was to Marv. There's a series of analogies across the experiences. But so somewhere in my brain, somewhere in my memory circuits, that the shape of that whole experience must have been captured as a kind of, what Hofstadter calls an essence. But it's the gist of it, that kind of shape must have been held there and just activated when Guy saw his muzzle and got all crestfallen as a result. Fascinating, really. Anyhow, that's that.